So when we talk about Pentecost, we are saying something about who God is. And here's my conviction about who God is. God is everywhere, all the time, all around us, breathing life into things and people and places. God is breathing life in us and through us and all around us, and sometimes we're actually aware of this. God is found in all experiences, including the most ordinary experiences, and things like eating and drinking, and friendships and relationships and gardening and creation and so on. Now, the ancient Hebrew people, they had a way of talking about this. They believed, and so when we're talking about the ancient Hebrew people, we're talking about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. They believed that everything that you and I know to be everything that exists because of this divine creative energy that holds all things together, giving the universe its life, depth, and fullness. They referred to this, they called this thing the Ruach of God. Ruach, wind, spirit, breath. Do you all remember this word from a couple of years ago in our Moment series? Jim remembers it. The rest of you, say this word with me, Ruach. Ruach, the ancient, someone even had the throat in the back. All right, Bob West. Ruach, the wind, spirit, and breath of God. Now, they understood Ruach to be as big as the universe, the thing that sustained even the stars, but it was also as personal and as intimate as the breath you just took and the breath you're about to take and the breath you take after that. They understood that Ruach was big, and it was also intimate and personal. Now, to see it a few places in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, let's look at some different context. The opening words of Genesis, the author says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape or form. It was dark over the deep sea, and God's wind, Ruach, swept over the waters. As the psalmist puts it, where could I go to get away from your spirit, Ruach? Where could I go to escape your presence? If I went to heaven, you would be there. If I went down to the grave, you would be there too. Ruach reminds us that God is part of everything and that life is fragile. As Job puts it, as long as breath is in me and God's breath, Ruach is in my nostrils. Or the way the wisdom teacher puts it in Ecclesiastes, before dust returns to earth as it was before, and the life breath, Ruach, returns to God who gave it. Have you experienced Ruach, the wind, breath, life breath of God? I think you have. So when you walked outside this morning and saw the ongoingness of creation, trees blooming, flowers blooming like they do, grass turning green like it does, this is Ruach, the divine creative energy holding all things together. And Ruach says, life is fragile. If you've ever stood over a casket, if you've ever driven past a bad car accident, if you've ever gotten the diagnosis of cancer, you know that life is fragile. And God is in all of it. God is also Ruach in the most ordinary experiences. Experiences like I had Friday night. Me and my daughters, Selah and Shiloh, 5 and 3, we got home late Friday night, about 9 o'clock. My wife is out of town with baby Breck. She's getting back today. But we got back late Friday night, and I thought the girls would just go to bed, and I would catch up on the Rockies game and chill out. And we walked in the door, and I said, girls, it's bedtime, jammies on. And my 3-year-old Shiloh does one of these. But Poppy, you promised we could build a fort. She calls it a fort. You all may have heard it called a fort. It's the thing that you build in a living room with all kinds of blankets and cushions and pillows and couches and chairs. And so at 9 o'clock on Friday night, here we were building a fort, and we get in the fort, and we start eating bananas and scones because it's the only thing my 5-year-old could find for snacks in the house. And at one moment, she looks at me with a scone and banana in her hand, and she says, Poppy, this is the life. Of course it is. Of course it's the life. It's 9 o'clock and you're eating bananas and scones at a fort in the living room. This divine creative energy is in everything, and it's adding fullness and depth and life to the universe. Have you experienced it? Are you with me? Because we have to move on and get to Pentecost. But before we get to Pentecost, Exodus chapter 3. We have to understand this story to understand the entire rest of the scriptures. This is a story that is told and retold in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. It is told and retold in the New Testament. This story always comes up. The story of Moses. Moses was a shepherd and he was a Hebrew. If Moses was Hebrew, that means his people were Hebrew. His people at the time were being held in captivity and slavery in Egypt under the rule of Pharaoh. Moses is walking along one day, and Moses encounters God. How does Moses encounter God? Do you remember? Fire. A fiery bush. A fire that stayed and consumed. And this divine voice said to Moses, Moses, you need to take off your sandals because this is holy ground. Now we have to understand something here. It wasn't as if God just showed up and made that ground holy and it wasn't holy before. Or it wasn't as if God made that ground holy but all other ground isn't holy. It's all holy. The ground you're on right now is holy. Take off your shoes if you need to. The ground you're on is holy. All ground is holy, and Moses was just waking up to this reality. And don't we do the same thing? We wake up. We pass burning bushes all the time. Sometimes we're aware of it. Other times we're moving about too quickly. What does this divine voice say to Moses? Moses, I've heard their cries. I've seen their suffering. And I'm going to rescue them. So what I need you to do, Moses, is to go to them, your people, and tell them that you are leading them out of slavery and into a new land. Moses pulls one of these. We talked about it last week. That lack of confidence, lack of trust, not trusting in the Spirit. Oh, who am I? Who am I to do that? Who am I to go to them? And God, what am I going to say to them? What will I say? God says, Moses, when you get there, just tell them I am sent you. Which is kind of humorous, right? Because Moses says, what do you mean tell them I am sent you? I go to my people and I'm just going to say very being itself sent me? Come on, God, you got to give me something better than that. So God says, okay, Moses, when you go there, when you go to your people, you tell them the Lord sent you. Exodus chapter 3, verse 15. It is a packed verse, and we often skip over it. Lord, can we have the next slide, please? This is the name given for God. You see this term, this word, this name, over 6,000 times in the Scripture. And when you see it, it will be capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And in the Hebrew, it's 4 letters, YHVH. A Yod, He, Va, He. Say those letters with me. Yod, He, Va, He. Now, some pronounce this as Yahweh or Yahweh. You see, later we came along and added in the vowels to the consonant. The Hebrew language originally didn't have vowels, which made it such a tough, difficult language to learn in college. Some say Yahweh, some say Yahweh. In some traditions, they don't even say the name because they believe that it's so holy, so mysterious, so sacred. And the ancient rabbis believed that these letters were actually breathing sounds, and that ultimately the name is unpronounceable, that these letters are essentially breathing sounds. So do this with me. Put your hand up to your face, just a couple of inches from your mouth, and utter these letters. Yod, hey, fa, hey. Do you feel your breath? Do it again. Yod, hey, fa, hey. Is the name of God the sound of breathing? Now, if you're a slave in Egypt, you're asking the most basic, most fundamental life questions. What does this say about humanity? And what does this say about God? Is God with the master? Or is God with us as slaves? Who's God with? Pharaoh was the ruler over the slaves, over Egypt. Pharaoh was considered to be a representative of the gods, or a representative of that particular religious system. So if you're a slave, you're asking, where is God and whose side is God on? Why was this story told and retold? Why did this story keep coming up? Because it's a story that says God isn't okay with this. God is with you. God is for you. God sees your suffering, and God is always with those who suffer. Now, if you're an ancient Egyptian, you're saying to yourself, but wait a minute. You're saying God, you're proclaiming a God who is standing with the underdogs. That's not the way of the gods. That's not how the gods work. God stands with those in power, because if you have power, you have the favor of the gods. If you don't have power, if you're a slave, you don't have the favor of the gods. But this God is about real hope for real people who endure real suffering in a real world. That's why this story is told and retold and over. In the Old Testament, you get this phrase, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And as you're reading, you're thinking, yes, we get it. You are the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt. Why do you keep saying this? It's a great reminder, isn't it? You were once a slave, and you received grace and liberation. Therefore, everyone you meet, every person that you encounter, you extend grace to them also. So when we talk about Pentecost, we're talking about these two things. The God who is everywhere, breathing life in us, through us, and all around us, Ruach. And this God, Yod, He, Va, He, is a God of justice who's concerned about actual suffering in the world. So shall we jump to Pentecost? It's a story found in Acts chapter 2. And I love the book of Acts because it's just these early Jesus followers who are gathered together, and they're just trying to figure it out, what it means to live life in God. They're trying to figure it out together. So here in chapter 2, 120 of them are gathered in this space on the day of Pentecost, and here's what happens. When Pentecost Day arrived, they were all together in one place. Next slide. Suddenly a sound from heaven. Last slide. Suddenly a sound from heaven like the howling of a fierce wind filled the entire house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be individual flames of fire lighting on each of them. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit. What word is that there? Trick question, because now we're in the New Testament, so it's the Greek, same word but different word, the pneuma, which is ruach, the pneuma, and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit enabled them to speak. There were pious Jews. By the way, all of these Jews would have been very familiar with the story of the Exodus. This would have been their story, their God. From every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. When they heard the sound, a crowd gathered. They were mystified because everyone heard them speaking in their native languages. They were surprised and amazed, saying, "Look, aren't all the people who are speaking Galileans, every one of them? How then can each of us hear them speaking in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, as well as residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the regions of Libya bordering Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism. Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the mighty works of God in our own languages." They were all surprised and bewildered. Some asked each other, "What does this mean?" Others jeered at them, saying, "They're full of new wine." In other words, others jeered at them, saying, "They must be drunk." Is it possible that God's Spirit, God's breath was already active? Because God has been active from the beginning of time, and the people gathered in this space on that day were just now waking up to a new reality. And is it possible that this same God Moses encountered in a fiery bush is the same God they were encountering at Pentecost? And what makes this story so profound is the storytellers were messing with all the religious categories. They started saying things like God's Spirit, this divine energy, was filling all the people. All the people. No, that's not the way the gods work. You must be drunk. That's what some said. You must be drunk. Know this. Anytime we start messing with the religious categories, there will be religious insiders who come along and say, "That's not the way the gods work. That's not the way the religious system works. There are some people who are worthy of God's love and other people who aren't. There are some categories of humanity that are compatible with God and others who aren't compatible." When you start messing with those categories, some of the insiders begin to shake. No, they must be drunk. That's not the way it works. On this day of Pentecost, 2,000 years later, today, what kind of God are we proclaiming? What kind of God have you experienced? Are you experiencing the God who hears the cries, who sees suffering, the God who calls us to go out? Are you experiencing the God who always transcends the boxes and the lines that religion has drawn for us? Are you experiencing Lord? Because that says something about who and what gets the final word. It says, we don't believe death has the final word. We don't believe racism and bigotry win. We don't believe things like terrorism, things like fear of the other, things like greed and exploitation. These things don't win. Why? Because grace wins. Why? Because it's our story. Remember the grace you've been given so that you might extend it to others also. What kind of God are we proclaiming? And remember, Ruah, the life breath of God. It's big. Of course, it's justice-oriented. But it's also small and personal and intimate. Where in your life do you long for Ruah, the breath of God? Where in your life do you long for new life? Maybe you feel distant from God. Maybe somewhere along your journey you were given not the idea of Ruah, But the idea of a God who resides up here somewhere and who is just simply looking down upon you, waiting to pounce, waiting to judge, waiting to punish. And this God is never truly happy with who you are, never pleased in you, and you could never really be in relationship with this God because this God is just up here somewhere. So to you I ask, are you breathing? Are you breathing? The life breath is flowing in you and the person next to you and the person next to them. God is as close to you as your breath. Yod, hey, fa, hey. What things in your life do you need to be liberated from? Ego, greed, anger, apathy, addiction, hopelessness. And you've thought you've been alone in these things. Yod, hey, fa, hey. God is as close to you as your breath. Ruach. Have you experienced it? Right here, right now, waking up to the God of new life, waking up to the God who breathes life in us and through us and all around us. Are you aware of this God right here, right now?